Hello, everyone, and welcome to War of the Stars, a Star Wars podcast. We are coming to you, as always, from deep within the Outer Rim, far beyond the watchful eye of the Galactic Empire. Joining me, as always, today is my co-host with the mo-host, Mr. Christopher Stolle. Chris,
Hey,
how you
what's
doing, man?
up? Hey, what's up, guys? Happy to tell you guys once and for all that he doesn't like you and I don't like you either.
And as also joining us today, he is the Jocasta Nu of Realm of the Mist, the keeper of the canon himself, Mr. Brian Miller.
This isn't where I park my car.
I'm concerned about the fact he just called you an old lady.
I know. Well, she looks better than I do, so, Apparently my web camera thought so tonight, too, anyway.
Well, yeah. And also joining us today is a very special guest. She is the professor of history at Laurentine University and one of the authors of the book Star Wars and History. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Janice Liedl. Dr. Liedl, how are you today?
Doing very well. Thank you so much.
All right. So as you can probably tell by the name of the book, we're going to be discussing history and Star Wars, or at least how they intermingle and how things that happen in the Star Wars universe can be related to or correlate to actual historical events. I've been reading the book, and it's a very interesting read. At least I think so. I am a notoriously slow reader, so I haven't finished it yet. But one thing I wanted to talk about when we get started, here, is now the book was written before the new movies came out. So there's a couple of things in the new movies that I would like to talk about, and particularly that period between the end of Return of the Jedi and the new sequels. And the one thing, particularly, I haven't really read a lot of the Aftermath books, but the one correlation I can see between what you hear about, kind of what's hinted at in Force Awakens, is it reminds me strongly, I want to get your thoughts on this, Dr. Liedl, of that pre-World War II period. That period right after First World War, going into the Second World War, where you had the appeasement thing going on with Germany. And that's kind of the vibe I get with what's going on with the New Republic, that you had the situation where you just had the worst possible cataclysm that has ever hit the galaxy. And you have these people that lived through that saw that now they're doing anything in their power to make sure that never happens again, at least the way they think it should be. So they're like, they see this new threat coming up, this new First Order, and instead of going at it and facing it head on, let's sweep it under the rug. Let's do whatever we can just to keep them out of the way so we don't have to deal with that anymore, because we don't want to have to go through another war. And
so it's basically, you're saying, did we get from a war to end all wars, the destruction of the second Death Star, the death of the Emperor, to it's all back again and even worse with World War II. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to link those two together. And I think we certainly could do a lot looking at the sequel trilogy and its relation to history.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people, when we talk about real history, that these people that, like the Chamberlains, Neville Chamberlain, and Prime Minister of England, who was Prime Minister right before Churchill took over, they get this rap of being, appeasing Hitler. But I think one thing that a lot of people don't understand is most of the people fought in the First World War. They lived in the trenches. They were in the trenches, or at least knew people that were in the trenches, and they saw the devastation and the horror that happened. So, right or wrong, their mind was thinking, we don't want to see this happen again. And I think maybe you can almost make the same argument for these people in the fictional world of Star Wars that were now leading the New Republic, that they saw all this happen, and they don't want to see that happen again.
And definitely looking for the ways in which history inspires so much of Star Wars has been a big part of this. I mean, you were right in saying that when Star Wars and History came out, it was just before the sale had been announced. So it was that same month our book came out. And then we were told just soon after that, we're going to get that sequel trilogy coming together, which made me really excited as a true fan, because I'd been around from the beginning and knew that was going to be coming. But we had no idea. Yeah, we had no idea when we were researching and putting the book together if that would ever happen. What we did know, though, was George Lucas himself was really keen on this idea of linking Star Wars and history. We had an amazing amount of access to George Lucas himself while we were creating this book. John Rinsler, who has written a number of the Star Wars books, the making of the various movie books, and was an editor at Lucasfilm at that time, worked with us to pull the book together, and George Lucas was consulted every step of the way because he really wanted it to reflect his take on our history and how that it influenced Star Wars. So, I mean, one of the first things to come away from, any discussion of Star Wars in history is, yes, it's totally legit. It's something that influenced George Lucas. And George Lucas said for also every distinct parallel you might want to make with Star Wars and history, you could probably come up with dozens of others, because he really believed that history reflected repetitions and rehashings of the same kind of problems. And so Star Wars did the same.
See, that was my takeaway from it. If I looked at the saga as a whole, was almost kind of a look at like people who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. You have the rise. You had the rise of the old republic, the republic that fell to Darth Sidious, and the rise of the Empire. And then the Empire took over the galaxy, made it a place of hell for 19 years, basically. The original trilogy, which I always looked at as either a look at the Nazi regime versus the Allied forces, Axis and Allies, or more specifically, when I was a kid, I used to look at it as kind of the Civil War, the North and the South. Mm-hmm. But then with the rise of the First Order, I always believed that as history coming around, because the new republic, as it was building itself, got arrogant, got corrupt, got bureaucratic, basically became the exact same thing the other republic was, which allowed yet again somebody to rise into power and to overthrow Rome, if you will. Yeah. So I always looked at the saga as kind of a lesson of those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think it's interesting what you said is there can be several parallels. Like you mentioned, the fall of Rome, and that's one I hear a lot, especially with the prequels, with this idea of this republic, getting to a certain point and becoming so corrupt that it's able to crumble, and this this empire. I also look at the again going back to World War I and World War II, the fall of the Weimar Republic, and again this republic that became so corrupt and so insular that this mad dictator was able to come in, and through democratic means, again, Palpatine came in through legitimate means, and so did Adolf Hitler. Hitler was elected. I think people tend to forget that he didn't just come into power and suddenly he's like at the point of a gun. No, he was elected Chancellor of Germany, which is another kind of odd take, that the leader of Germany was called the Chancellor, and the leader of the Republic was also a Chancellor. I think that's kind of a neat little tie-in there.
Definitely. And so one of the chapters in Star Wars and History that was written by Tony Keane, a professor who's a specialist in classics and also popular culture, he began with the story of how we could look at the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. And then next he went into the parallels with Napoleon, and finally coming around to Hitler. And in all those cases, we could see here are men who subverted a Republican system and democratic activities, and use those mechanisms against the whole system in very sophisticated ways. So Palpatine makes a lot of sense with all of those parallels. That's what's so delicious.
Yeah. Yeah, he's kind of a mix of, like you said, kind of a mix of maybe a little bit of Napoleon, a little bit of maybe Julius Caesar with a lot of Adolf Hitler added in there. Just a little bit of everything. He's got the the military acumen of like a Caesar or a Napoleon, but with the kind of that dictatorial, I don't even know what the word to bring about it, madness almost of that darkness of a Hitler.
It's funny. I would have more drawn a parallel to him to Joseph Stalin and the rise of communist Russia. Like once he was actually cemented into power. The major reason I go off of that mark more than Adolf Hitler is say what you want about Adolf Hitler. Obviously the guy was a maniac in real life, but he, unlike Chancellor Palpatine, actually believed he was doing what was right for his people, where Palpatine was just interested in power.
Definitely. So like I said, George Lucas was really of the feeling that we could, with this volume, pull together a lot of parallels that didn't just sort of define a few. These are the exact examples, but showed how history had multiple cases of different people who could be parallels or similar enough to make you see how Star Wars tied into the history and how history could help you appreciate Star Wars a lot more.
Yeah. All right, Brian, do you have anything to add so far with the discussion, or are you just listening in?
Oh no, I'm listening in. It's Star Wars is also one of those things that, like you guys were talking about, really reflects the time period of when those films come out, and if you look at each trilogy, each one is very different with the politics that were going on and kind of what they were kind of up against in the films. And with these new ones. If you look, I know Chris and I talk a lot on Star Wars Canon Podcast and on Breaking the Fourth Wall and stuff about the current day politics in Star Wars and everything like that. But, even back in the 70s, with the Empire, it was that, authoritarian kind of thing going in the 70s where, it was kind of representative of that. And then, when the prequel trilogy came out, it was, for some reason, that was when everybody decided to start dipping their toes into politics, and everybody thought they were a political expert like today. And then, now with these new films, you can definitely see some mirrored themes between what's going on, in our world today and what's going on in the films. And what I find interesting, and I'm not going to get political on this, it's just what I find interesting is some people who didn't care for it, or I'm sorry, people who liked it before in the other couple of trilogies, they have such a problem with it nowadays when they don't realize that they're the reason the world is the way it is, and that's why these films are turning out the way they are.
Well, that's a really good point about how the films, each of these trilogies, are reflections of their time, and that so much, again, that George Lucas, when he began the original Star Wars trilogy, was definitely influenced by the Vietnam War. The first chapter of Star Wars in History talks a lot about the patterns of wars of liberation, wars against oppressive powers that you could take a look at, like the American Revolution, or like the North Vietnamese, seeing themselves fighting the oppressors of the Americans in that war. So Lucas is really drawing on that. And he also pulls parallels to the political power and machinations that Richard Nixon carried on, and that, again, people of the generation in the 70s really saw powerfully to them. And again, in the 90s, when we get the prequel trilogy coming out, and the questions of the rise of populism and the powers there, and now today, people reacting with discomfort to the warmongering, the whole plot line in Canto Bight,
capitalism, kind of against the capitalism of the world.
Right. I mean, these are all creatures of their moment, and so we're going to react to them too in really uncomfortable ways if it's our own moment that's being challenged.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back to what you were talking about because, like you said, the first chapter was all about the rebellions and these kind of and in the book like you see, there's two things that you mentioned right off the bat. One, of course, is the American Revolution, Vietnam, and also the French Resistance. And those are three ones that I think are very strong parallels to what you see. Particularly, I think the Resistance, the way that initially, especially if you watch a show like Rebels, the animated series Rebels, of how these cells were kind of set up. It was set up very similar to how the resistance cells in France were set up, where each one was sort of self-contained and isolated, with the idea being you don't know anyone else other than maybe the one other person in your group, so that you can't give away the whole group. And I just maybe you can talk a little bit about the French Resistance and sort of the parallels between the early stages of the rebellion in Star Wars and how the French Resistance was set up.
Definitely. This fit right into one of the chapters that I co-authored with my co-editor. We look particularly in our case at the role of women in resistance fighting. And so how a leader like Leia Organa really reflects a lot of the reality of French resistance, that women were a prominent part. Women in French society under the occupation and under the Vichy regime, they had more of an excuse, more of a pass to be out there in public, moving around, passing parcels, doing public activity that a man would be seen more suspiciously, because why isn't he working at one of the approved jobs? So that women were a little bit more prominent. And as you say, they're very much cut off in the French Resistance purposely. So if you did get betrayed, you didn't take down an entire network or region. And that these people also had to be very, very creative in the way that they carried on the resistance. They couldn't come, full force and attack and take down, a whole base. But they could take down the leadership sometimes by coming in. There's one famous case of a woman-led resistance cell. They come running into the building and they plant all of these explosives and run back out and blow it all up. So they do great damage, but in really counterintuitive ways. And so, that's really what the rebellion is. When you've got a whole bunch of X-Wings and Y-Wings, and you're coming off of Yavin 4 and your last chance hope, I mean, that's a lot better than the French Resistance could be doing at that point.
Yeah. Well, also going to the American Revolution, and with this idea of this, at the time, relatively small group of rebels, and I just want to get something out there, this idea that it was strictly the farmers and the militia that won, that it was only the militia that won the American Revolution, is historically completely false, because it was the Continental Army. Yes, the militia played an important role, but it was definitely the Continental Army that won many important battles, and these trained soldiers that were trained and drilled to fight. But again, you have this small, compared to the other powers, relatively untested military force going against the most dominant military force at that time the world had probably ever seen.
John, not to interrupt real quick. I'm going to step away. It's time for me to do that. I'll be right back. All right. And also, I just want to be able to say, Dr. Malice, welcome to the stream. Sorry. Go ahead.
You're definitely right with talking about the American Revolution as the victory of the Continental Army and its allies, particularly the French.
That's what I wanted to get to was that you can almost make the argument that one of the main reasons why the the American rebels or the Americans were able to defeat the British was because of French assistance, French ships, French guns, French soldiers, along with the fact that the British were fighting a multi-force war. This is something I didn't realize until just recently, that the biggest battle of the quote American Revolution didn't even happen in North America. It happened in Spain. It happened in Gibraltar. But and correlated to the introduction in the original trilogy and some of the books that are now legends of, like, the Mon Calamari, and you have this small group of rebels who are just kind of fighting however they can. They win a major battle, and then suddenly that gets the attention of a major power. In the case of the American Revolution, it was the French. In this case, you can make the argument it was like the Mon Calamari with their star cruisers, be able to, finally get something that can go toe to toe with the Empire to some extent.
Yeah, definitely. Star Wars is much more complex than what we would think if you just watched A New Hope. And you saw the original film there. You sit there and say, oh, it's just this simple case of good guys, overthrowing the bad guys. But as we pulled out into Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, as you say, then the broader universe, even if it's been, made non-canonical, still put in a really great sense that this is part of a much more complex situation. As you say, we've got then the complications on the outer rims. We've got all of the outer rim worlds being involved, the complications there. And think in the American Revolution, the role that smuggling, that spying carried on, reinforces. We've got Han Solo. We've got the many Bothans who died to give us those messages. George Lucas was really, very much aware of his own historical resonances when he was writing all of this. And that was one of the things that was really neat with him giving us feedback chapter by chapter. He was saying, this and maybe also that.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, also what I find interesting now with like these quote unquote canon novels that are coming out now that Disney is doing this whole canonical thing, something that they're focusing a lot more on now that I've noticed that they really didn't focus on a whole lot in the original 6 films and Clone Wars, even in some of the expanded universe stuff that I've read, is now it's not just cut and dry good versus evil. There's this big gray area now in the middle where, like, the first time I noticed it, I was reading, there was a novel called Moving Target. It takes place between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It's a Leia novel. Mm-hmm. And Mon Mothma sends her on this mission, and essentially what they're doing, and this is before even Rogue One came out, when you see the gray area, the Rebel Alliance is dabbling in there, but they sent Leia out on this mission to distract the Empire with civilian ships to keep them busy so that they didn't know about the Rebel fleet amassing near Sullust to go attack the second Death Star. So they were putting civilians in the crosshairs for the greater good to make, to keep the rebels safe. And you've got Lost Stars where they're really humanizing the Empire. You start to realize the people in the Empire, they watch Alderaan blow up and they're sitting there going, what the hell did we just do? Like, what? I knew people on that planet. What am I fighting for, And you see these turncoats. I mean, spoiler alert for those who haven't played Battlefront, even Inferno Squad were turncoats. Even they defected. Wedge was a defector. You had all these people come from the Empire because they were disillusioned with the Empire, and it's just now they're focusing on this big gray area, this moral gray area that's it makes it a deeper world, but still that relates to what's going on nowadays. You've got, and I'm not going to name any particular group by name, but it's, you've got these people who are trying to say, oh, the bad guys aren't really that bad, they're all human beings, they're all people, just accept all of them. And then you've got these other people going, no, we've seen what they've done, and all this. It's back and forth. So it's still kind of reflective of what the world looks like today.
Mm-hmm. Definitely looking for the many shades of gray, and seeing that in history. Again, you can pull that out and talk about the way in which collaborators or turncoats there or people who just literally fell away from being able to support somebody that they had been part of for so long. And that always makes me think as well of the prequel trilogy and how we get both Palpatine's manipulations, but also we've seen behind the scenes people like Bail Organa is already preparing. He knows what's coming, and even though we could sit there in the long view and say we know Alderaan's going to go down, he's pulling things around. He's preparing for that. Again, it's not just the simple good guy, bad guy. And in history, we'd say it's never the simple good guy, bad guy. And I think you see that now a lot more with people talking about, how are we going to remember these historical figures? Can get into the whole Confederate heroes and their monuments, or we can be looking at, who are supposed to be the heroes in the storybooks today. And that really resonates now with, look at how uncomfortable Luke was with, being the hero now in The Last Jedi. So.
Well, I think. By the way, I'm back. I walked halfway in, but I definitely think that's a great point of topic. Is besides, we know for a fact that Emperor Palpatine was the bad guy. We know Supreme Leader Snoke is the bad guy. We know that Darth Vader was a tragic victim, but still a bad guy. But when you look at the soldiers and the platoons and the regiments, whether it's the clones, whether it's the stormtroopers, whether it's the rebels, whether it's the resistance, there is no good or bad. History favors the victor. Of course the victor is the good guy, but the soldier is just a soldier. It's the people who control the army that really dictate who's really good and who's not good. In the end of the day, they're with the exceptions of some fanatics. They're, on average, most people are just, this is my country and this is my job, or this is my empire, or this is my rebellion. Whatever you want to look at.
Yeah. Well, there was I saw a fan film. It was just a short little film, and it was, I think the setting was supposed to take place right before the I can't even think of the name of the battle. You can help me out. It was the Battle of Jakku, and it's these three soldiers. They're stormtroopers, and they're in the landing ship, getting ready to go down to the battle, and they're all talking about why they joined. And one was like, "Well, I needed the money. It was a job." Another one was, for whatever reason. The third one, he said, "My little brother joined. He was on the second Death Star. I saw him die. We got the news that he had died. I'm going to go after these, for lack of a term, bastards that killed my brother." So even, you have all these different, and you can say the same thing with any war, where there's probably many Nazis or German soldiers in World War II who joined in, maybe 40, 42, 43 because, or whatever, because they saw, maybe an older brother or younger brother got killed in the Eastern Front. So they joined not because they necessarily believed in what Hitler was saying, but they joined because these communists, these Russian soldiers killed my brother, and now I'm going to go and try to kill them. So.
To some extent, we can also use the American Civil War as a great parallel for what's going on between the rebellion and the empire to some extent here. Even back again with the prequel trilogy, that was a parallel George Lucas really wanted us to pull out, and we did in one of the chapters in Star Wars and History. And looking at that question of, I'm fighting to avenge my fallen brother or son. I'm fighting to defend some ideals or rights that have been trampled on by this evil opposing force. But people on both sides came to the American Civil War from that more than I am being a patriot answering the call of my national leaders. It could be much more personal, and I think Star Wars again does such a great job when you see how personal it is. For a lot of these characters there. Yeah. They're coming to, in Rogue One, they all come to the rebellion, these ideas, not out of glorious idealism, but of a lot of really complicated personal situations.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one thing you're talking about with the American Civil War, and again, especially with the correlation with the separatist movement, where it wasn't just necessarily one thing that led to the southern states seceding. It wasn't just the idea of slavery, them wanting to keep slavery. Yes, that may have been a point of contention, but it wasn't the only thing that led the Confederacy to secede. And the same thing with the separatists in the prequel trilogies. It wasn't just one thing that led these planets to secede. And I think it's interesting in the opening crawl of episode 3, where it said there are heroes and villains on both sides. And you can say the same thing with the American Civil War. There were heroes and villains on both sides. There were people that fought for the Confederacy who did amazingly brave and heroic things, believing they were fighting for what they saw as the right cause. Today's society, that's that again depends on your point of view. Another Star Wars quote.
It's all from a certain point of view, isn't it?
Point of view, yeah.
But I mean, one thing as a historian, I really do have to come in and say it's really important to understand that the justification for the American Civil War for secession was slavery. I mean, that's at the heart of every single one of the southern states. That's at the heart of the CSA, all the declarations. So it's there at the central part. And that was something when we were going through the editing of that chapter, we really wanted to push through. George Lucas was really fascinated by the economic issues. He wanted to look at the economic divide between an agrarian South and an industrialized North. And so when you see in the prequel trilogy, the very economic causes for uprisings, that's Lucas pulling out the economic theme from the American Civil War and playing with it in the Star Wars universe. But he also put some elements of slavery right in there too. I mean, Anakin is a slave. The prequel trilogy really tackles the issue of slavery head on. And if we get back to our good guy, bad guy question, look at how the Jedi have just sort of turned a blind eye to the continuation of slavery there under their noses. Well, we really can't do anything about this. Qui-Gon is going to help Anakin get out, but not his mom. He's not going to end slavery there. So again, when we look at that, we see all these different themes echoing out of the American Civil War, and that seems to have been really a deliberate interest on Lucas's part again.
Yeah, we do have a question from Dr. Malice89. I thought this was kind of fitting to the conversation we're on right now. He says, technically, wasn't the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the Separatists, really kind of, in a way, the start of the Rebel Alliance?
Well, in a way, yeah, that was the first. That was the first kind of organized group you had against this regime. I mean, obviously, you had Palpatine pulling the strings on both sides. It was just him playing a game of chess against himself. But from the outside looking in, or I should say, from the inside looking out, really, it was kind of the Confederacy. Remember, they didn't know that they were being played by both sides. Dooku did, but Grievous didn't. These other generals didn't. So they thought that they were rebelling against this evil regime, and maybe saw where the Republic was going. Because remember, the Republic turned into the Empire. The Empire, being an empire, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way it's run. If you have a good dictator in an empire, it's not a bad thing. If you have somebody like Palpatine, Mr. Saltine, sitting on a on a sit and spin, and he's trying to rule the galaxy with an iron fist, then yeah, it's gonna be, it's gonna let the hate flow through you. But no, it's one of those things. In a roundabout way, yeah, I guess it kind of was the first kind of breaking off, wanting to be their own kind of thing away from what they saw as being, I guess, Big Brother government.
Really, the way I look at it is at the end of the day, when you look at whether it's the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the Empire, the Rebellion, the rise and fall of all is really rested on the moral standings or corruption of the ones in charge, the leaders, and how they manipulate their supporters, people, military, economics. And I think Star Wars really shows that again. Like you said, with the Confederacy. It was literally just an arm of the puppet that Palpatine was stringing together to manipulate the Republic, and then the Empire. Obviously, we know how that went. That was bureaucracy and fear, and then the rise of the New Republic falls to bureaucracy and greed again. Rises the New Order or the First Order, which history repeats itself with fear and manipulation. It at the end of the day, it always comes down to it's not the common person, although they fall where they fall. It's really the leaders that we listen to, that we take inspiration from, that really dictate which side of the chessboard you're on.
Yeah.
So definitely looking at the way in which the prequel trilogy sets up for us this this mythology that the resistance is as you say has its prequels or predecessors there. All that I think that's a really great way to look at it because it ties into the sense that the rebellion has been foreordained. That we see that coming along in part of the this historical inevitability. Well, it's been falling apart already. As you say, we see the leaders here, but if we also step back and see the leaders of the rebellion coming along and sort of riding that wave, well, we've seen already the weaknesses in the old Republic. We know that Palpatine is creating what will be eventually this empire. We have to be ready ourselves. They do it pretty late, but they're built into that position by Palpatine already planning to take out the Jedi and their allies, the people who support the Jedi. He's kind of setting them up. Those who remain or those who survive that purge will be his opposition.
Yeah.
I have a question for the doctor, if I may. To kind of on topic, but kind of off topic. What got you interested and involved, not only with your historical pursuits, but then the interest of tying it into the galaxy far, far away? Like, what inspired you to pursue these endeavors?
Well, I can say that I have been into Star Wars from day one. I had a copy of the novelization before the film came out. That was super exciting. And I carried it with me all through my high school years. My dog-eared copy of the book still extant. So I was in Star Wars before I was in history. I actually became a history major fairly late in my university career. So I came to history later, and I've always enjoyed the two. But it wasn't until somewhere about 2009 or 10, I was talking with some scholarly friends, and we said, well, there's ways you can link science fiction and history. My friend and co-editor for Star Wars and History, Nancy Reagan, had already done work putting together volumes on Harry Potter in history and Twilight in history. I'd contributed to those. And when she spoke to me, she said, I know you're a Star Wars fan. How would you feel about working on a Star Wars and history volume with me? Yes, this is my dream, my ultimate hope. I never thought to get one because, of course, getting into something like Star Wars meant getting into Lucasfilm, and that's a really distant hope for any scholar. So yeah, that's how I got into it, and I dove right in with my I know Star Wars. Boy, do I know Star Wars. And that was very useful when we were doing this because a lot of the contributors to our volume knew Star Wars just enough to read it. See it on there, and they'd seen the films when they came out, but they didn't have a lot of depth into it, but they knew the history. And others were, they were there from day one, just like me. So we all had a lot of fun pouring in.
I just wanted to get on something that you, because I remember hearing you mention that before in another interview of you reading the novelization of it before even seeing the movie and getting the movie. And like for me, reading the Legends novels and then seeing the prequels and seeing Coruscant for the first time, hearing it described, what was it like having read these places described in the book and then reading about Tatooine and then seeing Tatooine on the big screen the first time, seeing the Death Star for the first time. I mean, that must have just been, because for me, seeing Coruscant for the first time was just I was in awe. My jaw dropped. I'm like, this is a place I've only read about. And I mean, what was your experience with that, seeing these places for the first time that you had read about prior to that?
Star Wars broke the mold, visually and musically for so much science fiction. So yes, I was blown away. I'd never imagined anything that looked like the Jawas coming along and their Sandcrawler. I hadn't, I couldn't visualize the creatures there in the cantina. So the visualization struck me so powerfully. I just remember walking out of the film sort of going, wow, and plotting, when could I see it again? And this was back in the days when we didn't have VCRs everywhere or DVDs or thumb drives or streaming. So that was a real work to do that. So I think George Lucas transcended the words and the written description. The people were really compelling in the book. All the characters were, and the storyline. But to see it all together, wow, that was far beyond. Yeah.
She was still disappointed she was still disappointed at R2-D2 not having clawed feet like he was described in the book.
It didn't get 100% of all of the tidbits there.
Yeah.
Or with with Ben and Owen being stepbrothers, something like that. Yeah, it was
something like that. Yeah. Or Luke's nickname Wormy.
Yes.
Hey, that made it back into canon now, though. With the novelization of Last Jedi, that made it back. Or no, not Last Jedi. It was Heir to the Jedi. Never mind. I don't want to talk about it.
And Biggs Darklighter. I miss Biggs.
Yeah. Yes, I would do wish we could have seen more of Biggs, seeing that relationship. But one thing, and I know this probably isn't your exact area of expertise, but I want to talk about this idea that I just thought about, that Star Wars is probably the closest we have in our society to mythology. And this idea that, how 100 years from now, 200 years from now, let's say, something happens to this society and it falls, but we still have these stories of, the Star Wars, of the chances of this becoming literal mythology, where people will tell these stories, hundreds of years from now, not as, oh, this was a cool movie, but as this might have happened. We don't know who, kind of like how you could almost look, with the Greek mythology and how that kind of rose up as stories, but eventually became part of their religion and part of their culture, and they believe these stories happened. And kind of this idea that this might be the closest that we come to our own mythology, and the parallels between mythological ideas and some of these things. I don't necessarily think of mythology, but I think of knights and dragons, and they're Jedi knights, and the hero's quest, Lancelot and, the Knights of the Round Table and the search for the Holy Grail. And, and you can almost, it's been brought up many times before of Luke being on the hero's quest to become this greater thing.
Dr. Malice says Star Wars actually happened. I don't know what your reality you live in.
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We all know that.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't Star Wars been recognized as an American folklore?
Jedi Knight is actually a religion. I know that much. I know when I was in the military, I met guys that their dog tags said Jedi Knight on them for their religion.
Badass.
Yeah. Excellent stuff. And I mean, with the recent books, The Legend of Luke Skywalker, I mean, we do have in the galaxy that sense. But I would agree with you that Star Wars fulfills a big part of the roles. It helps us tell the stories we want to tell about fighting evil. It tells the stories that we want to do about how you make those difficult choices. And also the stories of heartbreak and disappointment. I think the last trilogy, we're still stuck in the middle, at the end of episode 2 of a 3-episode arc, where it's all going to go. But we've had a lot of tragedy so far in
Well, and I think, and going back to someone who has, for myself, who has been in theater, done a lot in theater and stuff like that. I think people that are complaining about Last Jedi, and I know we've gone on tangents here. You have to remember.
We just did last night.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I saw it. How trilogies work, and you can look at the original trilogy as an example. The first trilogy, you introduce all the characters. You introduce them. You say who they are. The second trilogy, you put them in the worst possible situation you can find them in. Look at Empire. Everything had just gone to hell in a handbasket. Luke had just found out that Vader possibly was his dad. Han had been captured. Everything was looking bleak. And the third act, everything comes full circle, and the good guys win. And it's Star Wars. People, in the end, the good guys are going to win. I mean, with the exception of maybe the episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, but that was specifically written.
Well, we knew
as that.
We knew going into the prequels, 3 wasn't going to end on a high note. Like we knew that going in.
No, but it still ended on a
hopeful,
tone of hope.
Oh yeah,
a tone of hope with the birth of Luke and Leia. So there was that tinge of hope. Yes, you have Vader coming to power, the Empire, everything looking like, but there was still that hope. So in a way, it did end on a dark note, but almost like a dark cloud with a silver lining on it. So,
John, just real quick, two things. One, Dr. Malice says, kind of like how there are several different religions, but at the core they are all the same, like the different cultures calling the Force by different names. So that definitely ties in, because it ties into the fact that Lucas studied heavily, especially for the Force, a lot of works from Joseph Campbell. But the other thing I wanted to ask, we're at 49 minutes. I know our normal War of the Star episodes are an hour, but because of the special circumstances, do you want to go extra, or do you want me to give you your 10-minute warning?
We'll go a little bit longer today, not too longer. There's a couple other things that I wanted to hit on too, and you actually just mentioned it with religion. Okay. And the first one of the first chapters, they talk about the Jedi in particular, and this idea of correlating them between, and the book does, I think it was 3 different ones: the Shaolin monks, the samurai, and the Templar Knights. Yeah. And I thought those were 3 very, very interesting groups of people to kind of compare, because in a way they're kind of a culmination of all 3 of them. They're a religious order in the sense of like what the Shaolin were, or even or the Knights, the Templar Knights. I'd almost put them more with the Shaolin in many ways, but they also definitely have very strong ties to what the samurai were. And instead of in this case, instead of the samurai served their daimyo or their lord, in this case the Jedi served the Senate. and did the will of served the will of that's at least that's the way I kind of understand it. They served the will of the people through the Senate.
First and foremost, they served the will of the Force. I think the way I think you hit the nail on the head that the religious aspect to the Force, the religious connection to the Force, was definitely the Shaolins or the Templar Knights. Their military strategies was definitely the Templars, but I think the sense of honor and duty was really the samurai.
Yeah.
And the idea that this religious order had come to a crisis, has lost its way, gets strongly related to the downfall of the Templars. I mean, yes, they are targeted by a covetous king of France who's going to blacken their names by any means that he can. Hint, hint, think of Palpatine, doing this to try to attack the Jedi. But they're also victims of their own success. They've gone so much into money lending. They've become the banking system for much of continental Europe. They're much more concerned about preserving their order and their recruitment rather than just carrying out their activities back in the Near East where they were founded. You got to think that that parallel again makes so much sense where it's lost the religion.
Mm-hmm. And a little historical footnote: we have that King of France to thank for why Friday the 13th is the day it is, because that was the day that he launched his attack made his decree that every Templar Knight was to be executed in France was on Friday the 13th.
So Friday the 13th. So Friday the 13th, in a sense, was Order 66.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Essentially, yeah.
How many minds did we just blow right now? Because mine's just like...
Well, I was one of them because I never put those two together. That was...
Yeah. Yeah. It was Friday the 13th was the day that the King of France ordered the arrest and the basically the execution of every Templar in France. Mm-hmm. And eventually that moved on to other but I think to end the discussion we'll talk about some of the things in maybe Lucas's history, George Lucas himself, that he saw, that he brought, that we know for a fact that he brought in. I know for a fact, like with the filming, that he used dogfight footage.
Yes. So the dogfights from World War II were the X-wings and and the TIE fighters tumbling around each other, wrapping around each other.
And quote me and correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't he also use some of the chatter to kind of give an idea of what the pilots would have been talking and how they would have been talking to each other as they're going into this dogfight with each other?
Right. So he's using both some real footage, but a lot of movie footage from sort of fictionalizing the war to give that verisimilitude. We all understand that. We saw that and went, yeah, I know what that's like. It's a dogfight in space. So it's very well done. Very again, that's something that just strikes you when you see it as such a perfect historical parallel.
I mean, you could even attribute it, and I know I'm going to be opening a can of worms to a lot of people right now. You can attribute that to The Last Jedi and the bomber run scene on the Dreadnought. That was really parallel to like the Memphis Belle and the B-17 bombing runs of World War II, where half their crews would be destroyed long before they even reached the target point.
And
they were just open, slow targets, but. Obviously their purpose was designed to, if it comes down to one person left flying the plane, they could still open that bomb bay door and hit their target before that plane goes down, that bomber goes down. And that's really what we saw with the bombing run on the Dreadnought.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, and there's a reason why you mentioned the Memphis Belle, why that became famous, because I can't remember what the exact...
She flew 30 some odd missions and made it home every time.
Yeah. Made it home, yeah, and that was like unheard of. And I mean, even the fighter pilots of the First World War, their life expectancy was done in days, not necessarily weeks, days for an average fighter pilot at the end of the First World War. If you went 2 weeks, that was like, you're a veteran, you're an old man. So yeah, I mean, these, and like you said, I mean, yeah, those bombers in The Last Jedi were definitely, copied off of and influenced by the bombers of the Second World War, the B-17s and the B-29s.
Dr. Malice says, I don't remember the Allied forces trying to hit a thermal exhaust port that was no bigger than a Womp Rat.
The Allied forces
we
didn't have
could
the
give him a
force.
few original things he didn't have to take from history. But another thing I just wanted to take in there out of World War II history and weaponry is the chapter we have on the Death Star as the atom bomb. That was something, a parallel that Lucas told to us he wanted in there. I was a little disappointed with saying, how about, the dreadnoughts of the late Victorian era when they first came out and they were so scary. But he said, no, he really wanted to get the visceral fear, not just for people in combat, but for non-combatants. So that idea of taking war. And so the images that we would have of what the Death Star did to planets, he wanted that to be just as shocking as seeing the atomic bomb, the A-bomb explosions there at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or the ones we're more familiar with, the test sites.
Well, see,
so I think
you literally
did a fantastic job. It's really disturbing.
Again, you literally just blew my mind. So the destruction of Alderaan was literally dropping the bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Well, technically that was Jeddah. If you think about the test fire.
That's one thing I was gonna say. That when you see the test firing of the Death Star on Alderaan, it just seems like it just blew up. Like it's just there and it's boom, and you probably think, oh, they probably didn't feel anything. It was just a moment of they're gone. But then you see then you see Rogue One and you see what happened on Jeddah, and you say, oh, they probably. Yeah, it wasn't just. I mean, yes, it was quick, but they probably went through like horrendous pain, like for a short period of time. But still, it was just like
Jeddah. Hashtag remember Scarif.
All right. On that note, we'll take it around the room for any last questions or comments for our guest today. Chris, do you have anything last things you want to add or ask us?
Quite honestly, no. I just want to thank you very much for coming on. It was a real blast to talk this side of Star Wars.
Yeah, same.
And you taught me a couple things I didn't even think of in all the years that I've been a Star Wars and growing up in a military family and history family, things that I'd never put together between the two. So that's really, really awesome. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, you guys, because let me tell you, I don't get enough opportunities to talk Star Wars when I have to do history for my day job. So this is always great when I can come back to the one true fandom and talk with people who get it all just the way I do too. So thank you for that.
Not a problem.
And one thing I just wanted to add, I noticed on your profile that you went to Purdue University, so Big Ten, there. I didn't go, but I live 20 minutes from Champaign, so I'm a U of Illini guy here. So it's always good to see fellow Big Teners out there. So
there we go.
Yeah.
Go Penn State.
You came in late. You guys came in late.
You're the non-canonical Big Ten, right?
Yeah.
10.2.
So, Brian, do you have anything?
No. Like Chris said, I'll mirror what he said. I learned a couple things and just pieced a couple things together during this that I never really thought of before. Now I'm not gonna watch Star Wars the same now. When I go back and rewatch these films, I'm gonna see these influences a little more heavily, or I'm gonna see them a little more prominent when I'm watching it. So that's awesome. I've had a blast.
Oh, I got a question. The name, title of your Star Wars history book, and where people can find it. Because definitely, besides myself, I know some of our viewers and stuff may want to pick this up and read it for themselves as well.
The sad thing is it's officially out of print because it was a co-production between Wiley and Lucasfilm. I have a few copies of my own that I might be willing to send on to a few deserving souls, but you can find it in really good condition a lot of places online. So just check your favorite book reseller, Star Wars and History. It is published by, like I said, Wiley and Lucasfilm as a joint production. It's very pretty, so I'll just lift up my copy here with the shiny glittering cover and the many color sections in there too. So, it's very pretty. But I'm sorry it's not in print anymore. You can blame Wiley. They broke off their agreement with Lucasfilm. Silly publishers.
This is why we can't have nice things.
This is why we can't have nice things.
Exactly. So why don't you tell the fans out there, Dr. Liedl, where they can find you at? And
you can follow me on Twitter, Liedl, Liedl on Twitter. It's hard to spell because it's German, but I'm right there, and I will also be found on all sorts of places. But yes, at Laurentian University. And if you ever come here, take my history courses. I'd love to see you. Everything from ancient Near East through medieval, all the way up to the present day, pretty much.
Cool. Chris, why don't you tell the fine people here, there in podcast land, where they can find you at?
Well, first and foremost, you can always find me here on Twitch TV / Realm of the Mist Entertain, where we do not only great Let's Plays through Press A Gaming, but also War of the Stars, Star Wars Canon Library, and of course Breaking the Fourth Wall, and you will get them weekly, if not monthly, like War of the Stars is. You can also find us on YouTube. Just look up Realm of the Mist Entertainment. Make sure you give love and support to our Patreon page, and you can find me on most social media. Just look for Christopher Stolle, and like Dr. Liedl, it's hard to spell because of the fact it is German. Stolle.
All right, Brian.
Okay, so you guys, I gotta start with the list here. So you guys can find me at the Star Wars Canon Library on YouTube. That's a YouTube channel I started. Some of you guys already know about it. We keep all the canon material in chronological order. We keep it reviewed for you guys. Make sure to head over there. Chris Stolle and I are coming back on September 1st with the triumphant return of the Star Wars Canon podcast. That's going to be released on YouTube. So excited. Got so much to talk about. We got to come back from the break. Make sure to check out the Facebook page also for the Star Wars Canon Library. Give us a like and a follow there. We've got a live Q&A coming up on August 31st. We're going to be giving away a hardback copy of Thrawn Alliances. Make sure to visit the Patreon page. Give us some love there, and make sure to visit the website, StarWarsCanonLibrary.com, for the entire timeline, cover art for all the comics, novels, movie posters, TV posters, anything you can think of, including the Clone Wars chronological list. Aw.
And photobombing for my cat, Odo.
Aw.
Oh. Odo, that's a Star Trek
name.
Up
on my phone.
That's an enemy name on this podcast.
Odo of Bayou, the medieval bishop, not Odo of Star Trek. You're saying.
Okay.
Okay.
Redeemed.
Okay. All right. You can find.
One second, Mark. I definitely want to extend this on behalf of all of Realm of the Mist. Dr. Liedl, you are definitely more than welcome to come back anytime you wish, and we'd love to sit down and talk more with you.
Thank you.
All right. You can find me on Facebook and on Instagram at Mark Tolley. You'll finally mostly find there pictures of my little girl, my daughter, who had her first day of school today, or at least a meet and greet. Tomorrow is her first official day of school, so big day for the Tolley family. You can also find me on Twitter at JohnMarkTolley1, because, as I always say, I am the #1 John Mark Tolley on Twitter. You can find me. Also, check out the Facebook page for War of the Stars and Realm of the Mist. If you're seeing this on YouTube, like and subscribe. Support us on Patreon. And next month, I can officially announce today that our guest will be Zachary Fruling, who is the host of a podcast called Metatrex. And we're going to be talking about philosophy in Star Wars. So he's a former philosophy teacher and host a podcast about Star Trek and philosophy, and he's agreed to come on and talk about Star Wars and philosophy. So that should be very interesting. That's going to be probably the third week of September. Exact date to be determined. So
keep an eye out here on Twitch TV. Dr. Malice does say, turn around and say, Canon Podcast rocks. Everything else is out of the water except for War of the Stars, LOL. He said, you guys rock.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malice. I think we just lost Dr. Liddell.
Okay. All right, but with that being said, we will sign off. And remember, the Force will be with you always.
Godspeed, Rebels.